इसी में ना वापस
बैठ जाएंगे।
ये हो रहा है। तो मसला तो नहीं चला जाऊंगा।
नहीं चला जाएगा।
Ji sir, Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Sir, we are already live. Just letting you know. So we're already live. Just giving you that information. We'll start, inshallah, on the hour. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Achha, theek hai, sir. So we'll just wait for some of the other people to join.
आपका वो क्या होगा फॉर्मेट?
फॉर्मेट वो गूगल डॉक में शेयर किया था, लेकिन मैं जल्दी से बता देता हूँ आपको कि पहले क्वेश्चन किताब के बारे में, द प्राइस ऑफ पीस, जैक से क्वेश्चन पूछा है, उसके बाद आपसे और जैक से क्वेश्चन है। वो क्वेश्चन ये है कि इट्स अबाउट स्टेम डिसिप्लिन, के राइटिंग की क्या अहमियत है, क्योंकि हमें ये बहुत कहा जाता है कि स्टेम पढ़ें। तो ये क्योंकि राइटर है, तो मैं उससे आप दोनों से ये पूछ रहा हूँ कि शुड वी स्टिल बी टीचिंग हाउ टू राइट वेल, योर एडवाइस फॉर दोज हु आर कंटेम्पलेटिंग राइटिंग एज अ करियर। तो उसके ऊपर एक सवाल है। फिर उसके बाद एक सवाल उसके साथ और है, और फिर आपसे एक सवाल है कि न्यू लिबरल आइडियाज कैन बी सेट टू वर्क in opposition to Keynesian ideas. What is neoliberalism? Keynes made a forceful case for fiscal stimulus. Why? So Zach aa gaya. Hi Zach.
Everybody.
Hi.
Thanks for joining. It was quite a scare you gave me there for a little bit.
Sorry. Fortunately, it's a pretty open schedule today. So.
Okay, so before we carry on, we're already live on YouTube and Facebook, just giving you that information. So
right.
whatever you're saying here right now, people are watching you.
All right. Hi, everybody.
So this is Dr. Akbar Zadi, and I shared his profile with you in the Google Doc. He is a political economist. I'll be introducing both of you in the beginning, and then you saw the order of questions, you know, how I'm going to focus on some of the questions. You must be having a very busy schedule these days with this exponential, phenomenal success of this book.
You know, it's funny that yes, the book is doing well, but you know, it's also doing well in the context of a global pandemic where, especially in the United States, we're not managing it very well. So I have a very busy digital schedule, and then everything else is extremely low key. It's, you know, I'm just sort of here in the Northern Virginia suburbs, very, very quietly, you know.
So do you live outside of DC somewhere? Where do you live?
Well, usually my wife and I live in Brooklyn, but we've been outside of DC with her parents for the pandemic, getting a lot of childcare help with our daughter just turned 1, so you know, it's nice having the family all together, and you know, it's they have a nice place, so it's.
Have you done any international webinars before? You must have done a few of them, I assume.
International, it's a good question. I know I've talked to journalists in other countries. I don't know if we've done a full-fledged international webinar though. So I think you guys are the first.
Okay, I'm very happy to hear that. You're definitely ahead of the curve here. Yeah. By the way, your book was just brilliant. I mean, since I'm myself trained at the University of Missouri, so I mean, you can imagine, you know, that I read about Keynes a lot compared to the other mainstream economic schools. So it was such a, I mean, you were mentioning Paul Davidson, you were mentioning all these names, and it was such a joy to have somebody write about them finally.
Well, I met Paul Davidson at a conference at the University of Missouri at Kansas City while I was working on the book, and and you could tell he was so excited. He was talking to a room full of like 20 people who really got it, I think, and you could tell he's like, I've been saying this my whole life, and finally people are listening to me. You know?
And I'm going to officially thank you once I start my. Well, I mean, it's kind of started already, but I mean, we're just waiting for the third person, and then we're going to start.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. So the elections are coming up in the US. You must be pretty excited. I see you're tweeting regularly about it.
Yeah, I mean, excited, nervous, anxious. It's politically, it's just a very fraught and fractured time in
It
the
is.
States. I mean, the
You
pandemic.
mentioned, yeah, you
Right.
mentioned some of that in your conclusion. I was reading your conclusion again last night, and you definitely connected with, the kind of things that Keynes was working on, and the kind of what we are facing right now. So I think that this is going to be interesting, this discussion, to say the least.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, here, I think there's a lot of hope from people who are critical of the president that changing leadership will solve all of America's problems, and I think it will solve a lot of America's problems. But I think we have 30 years of sort of breakdown that is moving behind all of this, and piling a pandemic on top of it. I see a long road ahead, but the first step is taking care of the problem at hand, and we have a pandemic and an election to to get through before we can focus on the longer term challenges.
Akbar Zadi also teaches at Columbia. Akbar sir, maybe you can tell Zach a little bit about your teaching
I'm
engagement.
waiting for this background noise to go away. And I'll just, I'm on mute, I'm putting it on mute. Give me 2
Yes.
minutes, I'll come into it.
Sure. It's I think it's the Islamic call to prayer in the background, probably. Yeah. Have you traveled in these parts at all, or this?
Never to Pakistan. I think the farthest from DC I've been is probably Thailand and Bangkok.
We are definitely on the way.
Yeah. Well, although I don't know, I spent my wife's family is from Taipei, so we spent some time there too.
Okay, so we have our final, the last but not least panelist, Dr. Asad Saeed. Welcome, and maybe you'd like to introduce yourself quickly to Zach and Dr. Saeed. We are already live on YouTube, just to let you know.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hi. Introduce myself. I'm Asad. I live in Karachi. I'm an economist. I've been working here for a long time, and I'm not a macroeconomist really, but these are issues that I'm interested in, and
you have very interesting, how should I say, academic background, that you are from the same economics department as Keynes. You went to the same economics department.
yeah, but that doesn't really mean much.
Not to you, but for all of us.
Means something to me. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We'll start in the next 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to just go off the screen for 2 minutes.
Sure.
See you soon.
Aktas, I don't know why your name says Amir Hassan, but I'm sure you've got good reason. But I also wanted to ask, once we start, I also wanted to ask Zach a couple of questions, which I've asked a number of scholars, and I haven't got the answer to. It's about Keynes, and I'm not going to tell you now. I want to keep the suspense going. And I don't know if the last thing I heard Aktas mention was that my Columbia connection. So there's a professor called Etienne Baliba, whom I'm sure you know or have heard of, may have even read. I mean, he's from the revolution of 1968 till hopefully the revolution of 2020. He's been around and very much part of the intellectual tradition. So I took a course of his, and I'll ask you. I don't want to give you the question now. It'll be, it's like giving the exam question first and saying, okay. So it's a very easy question, but it's a very important question because anyway, I'll come to that later. I haven't read your book, unlike Aktas. I've read extraordinary and stupendous reviews I mean, the words, they've used words like spectacular. And I mean, after Robert Skidelsky, to write a book on Keynes is folly. And to write a book which is extraordinary, sensational, and spectacular is a work of genius. I mean, that's what many of the and very educated reviewers have said about your book. So, I mean, it's not possible for me now not to read your book. I haven't read it because over the last few weeks when Akbar told me about this, but I mean, it's fantastic praise. And in some ways, the story, we know the plot, right? But it's just the way that the things you talk about and write about. And I mean, the first few lines in the first chapter of your book is already quote unquote controversial, whatever that means. And, you know, you're writing about his sex life and his interests, and then how once he gets married, what happens, and then how things change. And it's just reading the reviews. You know, I read a lot of reviews in a lot of scholarly journals, not just in the mainstream press, and they, in many ways, help me decide what to read. And your book is, just have to read it. I mean, I've got other things at the moment, but perhaps put them aside. Extraordinary, extraordinary praise. I mean, and I have like pages and pages of you know, stuff from lots of other people who are writing, some which Akbar sent me. Spectacular book, and I mean, etc., etc. I'm sure you've read them.
It's been a good year for me. I'm not going to lie, but
You're probably the only person it's been a good year for. Let's put it this way. I mean, 2020 will be memorable for the book reviews on Zach's book, but I think, and maybe November 3rd also, but we'll see.
Yes, it's a strange time to be doing well, I admit.
Yeah. So Agnes, I just want to, whenever you start, I want to ask Zach a couple of questions about Keynes and the ideas that he was talking about, which, as I said, Etienne was not able to answer.
Okay, so Dr. Zadi,
at any point, if you're going to ask him some question about the book, and before, I mean, if it's about the book and Keynes, whenever you've done your questioning, I'd just like to ask him a couple of questions at that point.
Okay, sure. I'll note this down, and I will come back to you once the first line of questioning is done. Okay, so I think we've almost, it's 7, almost time to start. So in a few seconds, gentlemen.
You're going to be accused of a manel, so be prepared for a lumped backlash.
Okay. All right then. A very warm welcome to all the people watching, both in Pakistan. Good evening and assalamu alaikum to you in Pakistan, and those watching in the US. Good morning and assalamu alaikum to you in the US. It is my very high honor to welcome you to this Habib University webinar titled Zach Carter, Pandemic, Economic Crisis and Keynes. I would like to now briefly introduce my panelists. First is Zachary Carter. Zach is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. Hailed by the Washington Post as a spectacular new biography and celebrated by the Times as an outstanding, brilliantly incisive work, The Price of Peace has collected rave reviews from the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The New Yorker, The Guardian, and other major international outlets. As a senior reporter at HuffPost, Zachary covers economic policy and American politics and is a frequent guest on cable news. His written work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, The Nation, and the American Prospect, among other outlets. It is my high honor to have you, Zachary Carter, in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Then I have Dr. Asad Saeed. Asad has been with the Collective for Social Science Research since its inception, but actively started working as Senior Research Associate in 2003. Previously, Asad has worked as Senior Economist at the Social Policy Development Center from 1995 to 97. He was the Director of Research at the Pakistan Institute of Labor Education and Research from 97 to 2000. In 2001, he was Visiting Research Fellow at the Applied Economics Research Center, University of Karachi. He was also awarded a fellowship by the Asia Scholarship Foundation to conduct research on Thailand. Then I have Dr. Akbar Zadi, who has been teaching and has a research background spanning over 35 years, during which he has published several academic papers and books. He has authored works and monographs such as Issues in Pakistan's Economy, Military, Civil Society and Democratization in Pakistan, Pakistan's Economic and Social Development, the Domestic, Regional and Global Context and New Perspectives on Pakistan's Political Economy, State, Class and Social Change, among others. He currently heads the Institute of Business Administration, IBA, as Executive Director. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to introduce myself as well. You're very welcome. My name is Akbar Zadi, and I'm the Program Director for Social Development and Policy Program, as well as I teach economics at Habib University. I have worked extensively in Pakistan's development sector, both in Lahore and Islamabad. I also have the unique distinction of having taught at the leading universities, including LUMS and NUST. I write regularly for Dawn, which is Pakistan's leading English language newspaper. And I finished my doctoral studies on a Fulbright scholarship from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Thank you all for being here, and I'm very excited. And we have people watching us live on YouTube and people watching us live on Facebook. So without further ado, I would like to get straight to business and ask Zach a couple of very interesting questions about his writing experience. So the first question, here it comes, Zach. I hope you're ready. Please tell us about your personal journey that led you to writing this book. What are some of the startling discoveries you made along the way?
Well, for me, this book was in many ways a series, the product of a series of accidents. I kind of fell into a career in financial journalism in 2006 after a career as a punk rock musician sort of sputtered out. I started working at a place called SNL Financial, which is now part of S&P Global, but I was covering regional banking, credit quality stuff, just learning the sort of nuts and bolts of how banking works. And to be perfectly honest with you, I wasn't super interested in the job when I started. I wanted to be a musician to the extent I wanted to write about politics. But 2006 turned out to be a very exciting time to be studying banking because, of course, the banking industry was about to collapse. And I studied the financial crisis and covered it. And what really struck me about that era is that I had about a year and a half where I was talking to people who were very confident about the virtues of rational markets, very confident about the role that the banking system plays in society, and very confident about the role of the Federal Reserve in managing the economy. And by 2008, just about everybody who I had talked to had decided that their minds had abruptly been changed. So we'd gone from discussing the virtues of rational markets to the necessities of bailouts and fiscal stimulus. And I don't want to suggest that these people were hypocrites or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure there are some hypocrites in the financial sector, don't get me wrong, but people had been presented with new information and changed their minds. And it occurred to me that if everybody around me had suddenly changed their minds and become sort of a Keynesian overnight, they probably didn't know a whole lot about Keynes or Keynesian economics. They were sort of adopting it on the fly because it seemed, socially and politically necessary. So I started reading Keynes, and the first work I tried to sink my teeth into in 2008 was the general theory, and that is a tough one to start on with Keynes. He's a brilliant and beautiful writer, but very rarely in the general theory do you get that the lucidity and wit that I think makes reading him so exciting and fun. So I quickly shifted to studying to reading the economic consequences of the peace, and I found that an absolutely compelling work of sort of political theory and political journalism. But it's very interesting when you read that book. It's from 1919. There's not a lot of talk about deficit spending or public works or the things that John Maynard Keynes is famous for, at least in the Econ 101 courses that are taught in the United States. And so I thought clearly there's a whole set of ideas that Keynes is working with very early in his career that he brings to his economics when he becomes, the brilliant economist of the 20th century. And I just found the ideas that Keynes was grappling with, the social theory, and in a lot of ways the philosophy and the aesthetics that he was working with, to be intuitive and compelling in this way that I think a lot of times economics for people who don't study economics as a profession can be very dense and confusing. But understanding where Keynes was coming from as a social thinker made it easier to sort of untangle the ideas in the general theory when I finally got around to that. So what really surprised me was just how broad a mind Keynes had. At least I think of economists as specialists today, people who are involved with technical problems, whether either about a specific sector or a specific industry or a specific mode of thought, like macroeconomics, monetary economics, something like that. And Keynes was really concerned with the whole sweep of history. He's one of these sort of big Enlightenment intellectuals who's trying to fit ethics and political theory and metaphysics, the nature of the good, and all of this together into a sort of single coherent project. And economics is sort of the arena in which he was, in a lot of ways, I think, most successful. But it's certainly not the only thing that he was concerning himself with.
We're definitely going to get more into some of the stuff that you just mentioned. I have another question on the writing process, and I would like both Dr. Zadi and Dr. Asad Said to chime in after Zach. So you know the way we have heard so much about the changing nature of work, and I'm referring to this book, Technology Trap, by Carl Benedict Frey. Fry, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but I'm sorry about that. So we are told that the number of those skilled jobs will be gone due to automation. And so there is such a big push and pull for introducing STEM fields in academia everywhere. And here you are, you have written this brilliant book. So tell us more about, given this backdrop of this ongoing automation and this narrative that, most of these low skilled jobs are going to be gone. Should we still be teaching students in the university to write well?
Oh, I think the short answer is absolutely we should. The long answer is that these fields like these technical fields, this sort of emphasis on STEM thinking. I don't have a problem with that emphasis. People should study what they think they need to pursue the type of career and the type of life that they want to live. But even if you are a super highly technical specialist who's very good with calculus and numbers and the like, you have to be able to communicate with people who are not very good with those with those figures. And I think a lot of times, I'm not totally sure how economics fits into STEM, but a lot of times economists, when they get very technical, they have trouble communicating their ideas with people outside the field who aren't specialists. And if you can't actually communicate those ideas, you can't do anything with them. Because if non-specialists can't understand what you're talking about, you can't actually implement what it is that you're trying to get across. You have to find some way to reach the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. So I'm just going to ask Dr. Zadi and then Dr. Said in turn to...
Yeah, so I think there are two issues here, and I think we're mixing up two issues. One is studying STEM and writing well. I mean, you could do both, and it's not a trade-off. And I think studying STEM is very important at preschool, school, whatever level we are, even up to the undergraduate level. And it's not just to become good economists. I think it's a way of thinking. It's a method more than what we use that method for. You don't have to. You can know calculus, but that doesn't mean that you have to be able to differential equations. They're two very different things. It's a way of thinking about things, a way of organizing things. And I think that, I've read a great deal around this seminar for Zach's book. And I mean, there are cases where there's one economist whose name I forget, who read the general employment and the Keynes's book. And then he, while a professor of his was talking, he went onto the board and wrote a few equations which summarize the entire book. And it's not a mathematical exercise, but I don't think that, I certainly agree that STEM should be compulsory, at least until the first year of undergraduate university, and it can be at various levels. And the other point with that is, I think the connection that you're trying to make, I think is a false one. I think one can write very well and also use mathematics and maybe not. And there is now a slight turn away in economics from the mathematical model, and thank God for that. That, you know, it's more about discussions, discourse, narrative, and also what we call economics, or what we used to call economics. I think for the last, at least for my generation, and maybe Asad's and perhaps not yours, Akhtas, it's been highly mathematicalized. I think now it's gotten influenced by sociology, anthropology, history, and it's the same economics, and I think it's much richer. So you need you can do with the STEM, but if you can write well, you can do both.
Well, I think that I agree that you can do both, and you need STEM as a technical tool, but this ability to communicate is a very important one, and if you are unable to do that to a broader audience, then you lose relevance. Um, and that is and it's also, it adds um, art to science in a very interesting, in a very important way. So writing well is an ability, is a work of art, it's a work of creativity also, and uh, it leaves an impression on the reader, and those concepts kind of gel in and stick better, I feel. You look across the sciences, and some of the great scientists were able to write well. Richard Feynman could write really well. Einstein wrote a lot, not fantastic writing, but very lucid writing. Um, Amongst economists, one of the economists who got me interested in economics was Albert Hirschmann, who was a fantastic writer. And there were a lot of very interesting concepts that he could communicate. Bob Solo used to write really well. And then there are many, there may be many others, but I think that
Amartya Sen. Amartya
Amartya
Sen
Sen, of course,
is
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Amartya Sen is impossible to understand. Too dense for me.
And but again, it's so I think that goes really it's the other side of the coin. I remember that Max Weber, who's one of the most dense writers in the social sciences perhaps ever, um, was told that it's not easy to understand. So he said that he puts in a lot of effort to write, and it's up to the reader to make the effort to understand. So you know, different individuals have different sort of abilities, and they prioritize these things better. But it's always a pleasure to read whatever technicalities involved in good prose.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. So here, at the special request of Dr. Akbar Zadi, I'm going to bring him in so that he can ask his questions.
Yeah, I have a series of questions. I don't know how you're going to run this. I mean, I don't. It's just fascinating to as one of the reviews called that this most Keynesian moment when your book has been published. And as we were talking earlier also. I mean, so there's a number of questions which emerge about what Keynes is trying to do and how we are adapting him. One question which I have, which was just a straight, did this happen or not? Did Keynes? I mean, Zach, did Keynes read Marx and Lenin at all? I mean, he was later on an anti-communist. Some consider him to be an anti-communist. But did he ever understand what exploitation was? Did he read Marx? I mean, as I was telling you earlier, when I asked Etienne Balibar this, Etienne went back and said, he came back and he said, I've seen one reference to Marx. So in Keynes's writing, so you read everything. So that's just the first of interest question.
He is engaged with Lenin as a political figure because in a series of conferences, both beginning with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, continuing to the Treaty of the Conference at Genoa in 1922, he's concerned with the post-war debt obligations of different countries, including what was then very young Soviet Russia. So he knows who Lenin is, and he's somewhat familiar with his thinking. And in certain respects, he's an ally of Lenin in 1922, in that he wants the Russian government to be able to waive off the debts they've inherited from the Tsarist regime. It does not seem to me, I mean, I certainly wouldn't call Keynes a scholar of Marxism. He writes to people in various letters that he thinks Das Kapital is basically rubbish and irrelevant. He thinks that it is in many ways just sort of a new gloss on Ricardo. And Keynes really sees the way that he thinks about economic history in the 19th century. He sees it sort of as a battle between Ricardo and Malthus. And I think certainly for me that was a new thing to learn from the research. Malthus is best known as this sort of very pessimistic population theorist who says that the world is always growing population's growing at a geometric rate, and it's always people are always at the limit of resources. But he has another set of economic thinking, which in a lot of ways is kind of a proto-unsophisticated version of what Keynes eventually develops. And so Keynes sees Marx as sort of irrelevant to this debate. He's just another version of Ricardo. I think that is largely because the political concerns that Marx is talking about are not concerns that Keynes shared. So he doesn't have a particularly generous reading of Marx when he reads him. And I don't think he does. I don't think he works very hard to understand what Marx is about. Keynes is in many ways a progressive and shares a lot of, I think, Marx's sort of social values, but certainly not his politics, and certainly not the politics of revolution. Keynes is very afraid of social upheaval and of the sort of cataclysm that comes with an event like revolution. And Marx is, of course, quite comfortable with it. And I think that sort of different political attunement, the way they approach the world politically, it really made Keynes unable to see any of however you feel about Marx. He was a pretty smart guy who made some important observations. I think Keynes was rather ungenerous with him, but I think it also, as a result, was enabled Keynes to go beyond Marx and do things that were outside of what was then a very dominant paradigm in economics. In the 1920s and 1930s, people were either sort of Austrian kind of free market economists, or they were Marxists, and there was no sort of other school of thought that could explain what was going on. And Keynes really, I think, develops the school of thinking that tries to grapple with economic problems through the political system rather than through overthrowing it.
That's interesting. So the second of my three questions is that you must have seen Adam Tooze's review in the LRB on Greg Mann's book, where he makes a very, very interesting observation. And when we talk about this being a Keynesian times, he says China is world history's greatest Keynesian experiment. That China is living Keynes. And I mean, so this leads to the second, from what you said earlier about the politics of it. Now, first of all, is that correct? Is China Keynesian? And second, where does democracy fall into Keynes's understanding of the politics, in the sense that, okay, can you have strong totalitarian governments which are doing exactly what he would like to do in terms of the economy? And if not, then how, if you have a totalitarian or a command economy like China, does that make it Keynesian? So, I mean, questions around Keynes and China.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between sort of the legacy of Keynesian economics as a set of sort of technical tools for economic management, and Keynesian thought as a sort of body of values and ethics and political beliefs, which were, of course, informing his political theory. Keynes was aware, certainly, that a totalitarian government could use a lot of the tools that he was urging countries around the world to implement. That they could use those tools and they could get high growth at low unemployment and do all sorts of things with production that other countries, particularly during the Depression, were simply unable to mobilize. I think, though, it is a very fraught thing to say that the Chinese government is a model of Keynesian organization or social work. I mean, the whole purpose of Keynes's economic project is in large part, if not exclusively, to fend off the march of authoritarianism that he sees spreading across Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. He believes that if governments do not implement aggressive new programs to manage their economy, that he's particularly concerned with fascism, because that's the most dire threat that seems to be happening in Europe. With after World War I, you have Mussolini marching on Rome by 1922. You have Hitler with the beer hall putsch in 1924. There are all these right-wing murders that are happening, political assassinations across the continent. So Keynes is really worried that if governments don't get their act together and stop the sort of economic freefall that's happening after the war, then these totalitarian governments are going to take power. So I think it's very problematic to talk about authoritarian governments being Keynesian in that sense. But that said, the deficit spending can be done by any type of government, democratic or otherwise. I think Keynes would be horrified to see his name associated with communist China in particular, but he would probably look at the way that China managed the 2008 collapse and say, well, there were some tactical decisions there that were better than decisions made in other parts of the world.
So then the critique of Keynes from those on the left is that, okay, he's basically rescuing capitalism. And when we say, whether it's a 2008 crisis or whether it's a 2020 crisis or 97, wherever we are, and you use Keynes to basically bail out or fiscal spending, deficit financing, whatever you want to call it, a system which could be on the verge of at least an implosion, if not a collapse. Now, is that a fair assessment? Is he the last bastion of capitalism in terms of, okay, when things go wrong, throw in Keynes?
I think these are very difficult questions, but I do think that certainly the way that we have sort of implemented Keynesianism in the United States and across Europe over the last 40 years fits the description that you've just laid out. I think it's also possible to think about doing Keynes in a more sort of holistic manner, not as just sort of an emergency rescue program when things go wrong, but as a way of trying to manage society so that citizens can realize the basic building blocks of what Keynes would have considered a good life, which would resemble his life in Bloomsbury in London at the turn of the century, where he's learning from Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster and all of these writers and artists who are part of this big sort of international cultural milieu. And in that sense, I think it's important to remember what Keynes actually did when most of his life, Keynes is losing the major policy battles that he's getting involved in. But that changes in World War II. And the British government, in the final years of the war and its immediate aftermath, does a lot of things that I think most people today don't associate with Keynes. But the most prominent of them is the creation of the British National Health Service, which is nationalizing, socializing, not just British health insurance, but British medicine. And Keynes is the financial architect of that project. Keynes does that for, I think, very anti-revolutionary reasons. He thinks that if you take care of people in this way, if you protect them from the vicissitudes of the market, they'll be less likely to revolt. So in that sense, he's sort of protecting what we might call capitalism, but he's doing it by socializing an entire sector of the economy. So I think it's very tricky to talk about Keynes as either a capitalist or a socialist. I think of him more as someone who's trying to rescue Enlightenment liberalism from the dangers posed by economic collapse. And whether which label we choose to apply to that, I think will depend on which sort of aspect of Keynesian thought or policy making we're looking at.
Okay, so Zach, some of our viewers may not know much about Keynes. I mean, they might not be very familiar with Keynes. So could you please just very quickly answer the following question. So this is for the edification for those who may not know Keynes' importance. And I'm not going to read the quote from chapter 12, which was a really beautiful quote that you wrote about Keynes, but how would you describe Keynes to those who may not be familiar with his name, work, and times? And if you could do that very, very briefly, I would really appreciate, because I have a number of questions that I have to go through in the next half hour.
Keynes is a philosopher from the University of Cambridge who worked with people like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein to pursue ideas about human thought and social organization, who ended up becoming an important, if not the most important, economic manager of British war finance in World War I. And from there developed a way of looking at economics that we now call macroeconomics, which did not exist prior to his work. And then he became famous for urging countries to adopt deficit spending in the 1920s and 1930s in order to correct the economic freefall that the world had dipped into after World War I.
So in other words, he was a big proponent of using fiscal levers of policy as opposed to monetary levers of policy. And what was his biggest gripe against using monetary levers of policy, in your opinion?
Well, he advocates for monetary activist sort of monetary policy in the 1920s, but
he also mentions that there are many slips between the cup and the lip, if you remember.
Yes, he changes his mind over the course of the 20s. So his biggest objection to the use of monetary policy to correct things is that it doesn't seem to be working. In the 1920s, he keeps waiting for the economy to correct in some way. If you make the right monetary adjustment, things should work out. And even if you make the wrong one, eventually there should be some sort of correction that happens in the market. And that just keeps not happening. And so he comes to be an advocate of fiscal spending long before, of large budget deficits and public works by the government, long before he has a sophisticated sort of scientific economic theory to justify that policy strategy. But then, of course, in the 1930s, he does develop that theory, and it becomes enormously influential around the world.
Okay, so next question is for Zach and Dr. Asad Saeed.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Zach, the big question for myself and I suppose the three of us sitting in Karachi, Pakistan, having gone through massive urban flooding in the last week, is the relevance of Keynes to developing countries. And that I've always sort of struggled with, and having read some of the literature around Keynes lately, I have a new sort of appreciation for what came about as or was known as development economics, and also the underlying political and social realities of it. So we kind of live in, so Keynes in a sense was living in a world of formal markets, of a formal economy, and a state which had capability and intent. So in a very Westphalian world, we kind of traverse a Hobbesian world and a Westphalian world. So it's life is nasty, brutish, and short for a lot of people in the developing world. Even if we want to tax, we cannot tax. Even if we want to have a formal economy, we cannot. I was reading through MMT, Akbar's sort of hobby horse, and I'm afraid the sort of economic autarky that something like MMT would prescribe is just not possible. It would be a disaster in most developing countries, because your productive capacity is so narrow. and the whole notion of what capacity utilization means is a different thing altogether. So yes, some of those fiscal policy levers are useful, and we can work through them. But how relevant do you think Keynes is to a world which actually hasn't really changed much from then in terms of um, its Hobbesian nature? And that's really a political question also, because states are the way state formation has happened is very different.
I have two thoughts on this. I think it's a really fantastic question. Um, the first is that broadly, I think the portrait that you sketched there is basically right. Keynes is concerned largely with a type of economics in which scarcity is not the dominant concern of the economics profession. That the thing that matters most for making economic decisions is uncertainty about the future, not the limits of resources and capacity. That in many ways the world that Keynes is talking to and the policymakers he's talking to in the 20s and 30s have enough stuff to go around. The question is actually making it go around. That is a different sort of set of concerns than you have in most development economics today. But that said, I think the principle there about uncertainty is really useful. It requires a lot more I should say development and specialization in the context of development economics. But the fact that we don't know what the future will bring, I think in many ways is even more important in the context of a more politically uncertain community than it is in one where rules and legitimacy and the like are more stable and established. So if you think about Keynesian economics more as a way of approaching economic thought than as a set of sort of clear principles and sort of management tactics, then I think a lot of the stuff that he has to say about how people make decisions, what types of decisions end up leading to what types of political outcomes. I think that area there's quite a lot to be that can inform your work, but there's work that needs to be done. You can't just open the general theory and get a guide to to how to how to raise the standard of living in the developing world.
Okay, so thanks for that answer. Now, next question addressed to all of you. Neoliberal ideas can be said to work in opposition to Keynesian ideas. What is neoliberalism? Keynes made a forceful case for fiscal stimulus. Why? I mean, you partially answered that question. And why is there so much opposition to fiscal stimulus everywhere? So I can start with Zach, and then we can move to Akbar Zadi and then Asad Saeed.
I think neoliberalism is the easy part of that question. There is a school of thought that develops in the 1940s led by Friedrich Hayek and a handful of other major intellectuals broadly associated with the sort of international right as a sort of intellectual response to the spread of New Deal liberalism in the United States, Keynesian liberalism in Europe, and a lot of sort of soft socialist policies in Europe associated with like the British Labour government. So things like the British National Health Service and the like. These people are very much like Keynes in that they're interested and have a great deal of veneration for the Enlightenment liberal tradition. And they really want to they want to wrest the mantle of liberalism away from Keynes, away from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and sort of implement a more conservative sort of vision for that tradition. And for many years, they're just not considered very relevant in American and European policymaking. It's sort of a weird club of fairly wealthy intellectuals who meet in Switzerland, every year to talk about how irrelevant they are. But by the 1970s, they really take over the economics profession, and then I think really the sort of political imagination of the world. And the sort of political high watermark for neoliberalism is probably the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, late 70s and early 80s. But in a lot of ways, the sort of triumph of those ideas can be seen in the United States through the policies of what was once sort of a left-wing party in the United States, which is the Democratic Party. In a lot of ways, the sort of policy making that was pursued by certainly by Bill Clinton and to some extent by Barack Obama, I think reflects the sort of neoliberal thought in which markets are sort of the real domain of democracy, that it's not the voting booth, it's not the political system that expresses your will, it's the marketplace. And so we want to get politics out of the market so that people can be, in this is sort of the neoliberal vision, be free to make their own choices. I think Keynes saw that as sort of a silly understanding of freedom. He had a very different view in which people wanted to pursue a particular kind of life. There were certain things that were good that everybody wants, and that they can pursue those through the political system.
Okay, so let me thank you for that answer. Let me ask Akbar Zadi, why is there so much opposition to fiscal stimulus everywhere, including Pakistan?
Not today. There's no opposition today. That's all they want. So actually, I want to go back to what Zach said, and I wouldn't agree completely with you. I would actually think that we have, this goes back to what I said earlier, that in some ways you've got Keynesianism rescuing capitalism, or even neoliberalism. In fact, post-Obama 2008, that's precisely what you get. And one of the questions, if we had more time and we were just interviewing you rather than talking about other things, I was going to ask you, but what about social distribution? I mean, where does Keynes come into that? You've got your fiscal stimulus. You're providing, you're saving, General Motors and Ford and the capitalist enterprise and the banks. I mean, the greatest criticism of the Obama intervention and Clinton-Obama continuity was this whole idea of Wall Street determining much of what the fiscal stimulus comes to. So it's interesting that on the one hand, one can see a fiscal stimulus of those on the Democratic Party or on the left of Trump, which is a few people, but those who are on the left of Trump saying that, okay, you need a fiscal stimulus, otherwise your entire system collapses. On the other hand, you have those on the left who would say, fiscal stimulus for whom? What about issues about distribution? And I think that's the key thing that I find missing in what I've read from Keynes and of Keynes and about Keynes. This issue of, Zach spoke about scarcity, and that didn't really matter at that time. And now we have an issue of where there's very high income inequality, and where the fiscal stimulus, who's benefiting by this fiscal stimulus? Even today, in the post-March 2020 order, where quantitative easing takes place, where money is available, in Europe it's different. I mean, that's also a very interesting thing, that if we have Keynesianisms rather than one. I mean, now if there's an Obama-esque Keynesianism, whatever that is, there's a very different European model. And if there's a Chinese type of intervention, that's a very different model. So I think what Zach said earlier, that these are perhaps tools, these are ideas, this is a philosophy, and you have a philosophy which is used very differently. In Marx, you have social democracy. You can have social democracy which follows. You can have Leninist policies that follows. You could even claim that North Korea has some element of some threads coming from this. So these are large philosophy. I think the word that you use, it's a large philosophy more than anything else.
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that we live in many ways in a Keynesian world, but the way that Keynes is sort of understood by different people in power varies quite a bit. Keynes, himself didn't really want to be remembered as sort of a deficit therapist. He was concerned with the big social problems of his day, which were war and depression and the march of authoritarianism. And in the general theory, he talks specifically about inequality, which we could also describe as distribution. Keynes is opposed to inequality on fairly straightforward moral grounds. He thinks severe levels of inequality are morally unjustified. He thinks the levels of inequality that he sees around him in Britain at the time he's writing the general theory are morally unjustified, which in a lot of ways is, I think I just think it's an important thing to emphasize, because today, those levels of inequality, look like sort of a lost golden age in the United States. They're much higher and more severe today than they were in 1936. But he says about the general theory, if I'm right here, then I've broken down one of the arguments in favor of inequality. Before the general theory, there was this belief that you had to have these large fortunes accumulated in order for there to be big piles of capital to be invested in new projects that could then, move the world forward to progress and harmony. And Keynes was really arguing, no, it's not the amassing of large fortunes that matters. It's the sort of purchasing power of the masses that matters. And so if you focus on purchasing power, then you have, you don't have to, pursue a more egalitarian society. You could do the kind of fiscal stimulus that you just described, which is, essentially targeted for the wealthy. But you could pursue a fiscal stimulus that's oriented towards alleviating inequality. And that's certainly what would have been what he would have advocated for. It's what he did advocate for during his lifetime. But in a lot of ways, I think the triumph of Keynesian thought over the 20th century has been a result of people being able to sort of push away the political preferences of the guy who developed these things and use those ideas for their own ends.
Asad, I just want to ask you.
I mean, my understanding is of neoliberalism, and the onset of neoliberalism is its political and social context also. So neoliberalism came whenever the idea started floating in the 40s, probably even earlier. But it came on the back of the golden age of capitalism after the Second World War up until the late 60s, faltering very sort of significantly and in very important ways. Now, that golden age of capitalism had Keynesianism in it, obviously, because there was the aggregate demand was not only managed but increased significantly. But also it was a sort of, it was also the political compact of the time that allowed the profit rates to actually, the share of labor in your surplus to be higher than that, or growing much faster than the rate of profit. So that was a very important element of the golden age of capitalism. That started faltering for various reasons and could not withstand the oil shocks. So the 73 one and also the 79 one, and brought about stagflation, which created its own set of politics. So now if you go by, and this is a question that I need to put to you, that if you go by what it's sort of, in a sense, pure Keynesianism would say is about demand management and fiscal stimuli, is that in principle, it should not affect distribution. So you get a shock, like you get a COVID shock, or you get a 2008 shock, or many others. What you need to do is to restore aggregate demand without changing distribution much, and you're in some ways back on track with a fiscal stimulus. What happened in that golden age was much more, had an element which was more than Keynesianism. So is that, you think it has worked that way, or?
It's tricky to say, as with all of these questions about Keynesianism and what it is. I mean, you have to distinguish between the way that it has been defined by people who refer to themselves as Keynesian economists implementing these policies around the world, and the set of ideas that Keynes had in his mind when he was developing these theories. Most economists don't even read the general theory anymore. They read sort of interpretations of the general theory by other people. Paul Samuelson's probably the most famous with his textbook that really ran the textbook for macro for a long time. But the idea that you need to be distributionally neutral in order to get things back on track, that is an idea that people have expressed But during the golden age of sort of post-war capitalism for the United States that you reference, it's not true that that era was distributionally neutral. The United States saw very steep declines
but
in
its origins were in something different, right?
Well, I mean, yes and
It could
no.
have been distributionally neutral, or it could not have been distributionally neutral.
Yeah, I think there were political reasons in the United States, people, for reasons that I think Keynes would have himself, approved. Political leaders in the United States wanted to reduce inequality, which in the United States is expressed through all sorts of different metrics. But the racial wealth gap, unemployment, the like. There were all sorts of reasons why people wanted politically to reduce inequality. But the sort of Keynesian tools that they adopted. In order to get money out the door and who they were getting it to, I think resulted in quite significant changes in distribution, at least through the 1970s.
You had very strong the trade unions.
Yes.
So now that was a very important part of the political compact in Europe and in the United States. And also you had Fordist technologies which enabled trade unionism to work. So the nature of work today has changed so much also, that even if you want that sort of working class solidarity, it's very difficult to create it because work has become dispersed.
Disaggregated, and people are atomized and isolated.
And in a way, the scary bit of this COVID situation has been that it's becoming even more dispersed and much more unequal also.
In the interest of time,
all of us can sit at home and do what we do.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question to Zach, taking Keynes from his context of in between the wars to the 21st century. I mean, how does Keynesianism play itself out in a world where globalization dominates, and that neoliberal globalization, and we've had different types. So that means my fiscal stimulus doesn't stay within my borders and others benefit. I mean, Europe is a very interesting example, from Greece to Germany and Spain, trying very different models of different types of quantitative easing, but it doesn't stay within. So how does one model or think about Keynesianism, which was meant for largely an autarkic system, whether it was reform, whether it was intervention, that flows across borders. So how does that work out?
Yeah, I think we're used to thinking about, and the way we're talking about it throughout this webinar, thinking about Keynes as sort of a national economy thinker, someone who enables states to manage their economies. But Keynes was also an internationalist in a really important way. I mean, he played a really important role at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. And his role at that conference was in many ways the culmination of decades of thinking about the international system. He comes to the general theory after watching the breakdown of the gold standard in the 1920s. And the gold standard is not just a national monetary policy system, it's an international trade and monetary union. And Keynes his belief ultimately is that these sort of national demand management strategies can help with international harmony by preventing countries from just really going off the cliff, right? And then falling into these sort of social pits of misery and sort of antagonism, where you have high unemployment and you blame the foreigners. I think he believed for that his sort of vision of the world to really be realized, you needed to have international cooperation and international agreement about what constituted fair play between nations, and also what to do when one nation got into trouble. So one of the principles that he really pursued and ultimately didn't really succeed very much in securing at Bretton Woods was the idea that countries that get into trouble, either by accruing large budget deficits or large trade deficits, shouldn't be exclusively on the hook for getting themselves out of the hole. There should be a give and take between successful and wealthy countries.
The idea of the bank board and the International Clearing Union. Okay, so we don't have much time left. I would just like to recognize a few of the questions are being asked on YouTube. One is very interesting. We've already spoken about this, and this is by Rafi Mansouri. This person writes that despite his approval, that is Keynes's approval, are there significant parallels between Keynes and Marx? I recall a positive citation of MCM Prime and a shared agreement on the marginal effect of capital driving accumulation. So yeah, I mean, I've actually seen that reference to MCM Prime in Keynes's work. And if you look at the work of Dudley Dillard and the like-minded economists who have basically argued that Keynes is making a case for a monetary production economy, an economy in which money is as important as capital, labor, and other inputs. So yeah, he definitely got the MCM prime concept from Marx, but there is not much engagement between Keynes and Marx after that. And I think Zach already addressed that question. Rafi Mansouri also asks, does Keynes discuss the implications of his conception of human nature, animal spirits, on the distribution of fiscal injections, because fiscal stimuli are never impartial? So what is Keynes's conception of human nature? I mean, is it somewhat like what we have come to believe or what we have seen in neoclassical economics? I mean, is it basically, he's not thinking rational utility maximizing agents. What notion does he have in mind?
Yeah, no, this is very important because if a lot of the countries that have implemented Keynesian stimulus sort of accept the sort of classical foundations of economics and their conceptions of rationality and what human beings want from the economy. And in a lot of senses, I mean, I think we know that those are not true. People, even sophisticated defenders of them today, talk about them as useful rules of thumb, better than other models that we can put forward. But we know that people don't maximize their profits at all times, right? And we also know that people don't always make rational decisions. For Keynes, the issue is not your ability to maximize profits that matters. It's your ability to realize a good life under conditions of uncertainty. Not everybody needs more money to be happy. Many people do. But for Keynes, he's trying to get to a place where people can, be like him in 1914 or 1913 before the war, living with Virginia Woolf and learning about art and doing all of these fun kind of upper class things that he got to do. And it's the activity that matters to Keynes, not the sort of numbers in the bank account. And so he is always sort of focused on that sort of goal, which in a lot of ways I think is naive, but I also think it's a more realistic portrait of what people want out of life than what you see in classical economics.
But you can only do those things if you have money in the bank. So it's not, I mean, you can't do those things if you're struggling at a 14-hour shift.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it is a decadence comes, whether it's Bloomsbury, Virginia Woolf, and his other thing, decadence or the good life, if you prefer, comes about through, you have to be able to afford it.
That's
so
right.
There is, so, what you just said that fine, it's a very, in some ways, if it's his lifestyle, the question that Akhtar asked about, his philosophy, it's live and let live and let's party. Basically, but you have to have the money in the bank to be able to do that.
That's a good point. I think I've received. I've just two more questions that I must.
Can I interject this? I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but just a quick one on internationalism. So you do have the Bretton Woods and his intervention there, the economic consequences of peace. I think he was prescient, but also the Bengal famine, where he turns out to be a nationalist of a very different kind. Now, I'm not in a position to say that what Utsa Patnaik has written is all completely correct, except that it's a strong case. So, in some ways, he's the product of his time also. So there is that level of nationalism at that particular point in time, which kicks in also. So,
well, I would like to just make a quick point here about that paper. I mean, Keynes, if you want to saddle Keynes with responsibility for the Bengal famine in the sense that he is a major British Treasury official at the time when this happens, I mean, I think that is, you know, you don't need a sophisticated paper to make that argument. The argument that's in place in that paper is that Keynes was intimately involved with the economic decisions that led to the Bengal famine, and I don't know if that is a reasonable interpretation. We have a very strong record of what Keynes was doing in 1942 and 1943 and 1944, and it's an enormous amount of diplomacy with the United States at a time when he's very, very ill. So I do not find it compelling to argue that Keynes is some sort of feverish nationalist who is willing to sacrifice millions of people in Bengal for the sake of the British war effort. I think it's more reasonable to say that through neglect and sort of British chauvinism, a sort of casual British chauvinism, these things happen while he is playing a major role in the Treasury.
And surely not a racist like Churchill.
Certainly not a racist like Churchill, but you know, Keynes would not be like a contemporary woke warrior in the United States either. You know, there are all sorts of things that he said and did that would, you know, offend different parties in the United States today. But you know, he also wanted to use economic policy to stop divisions between people. He thought ideas about race and nationalism were really dangerous. And that economic policy was a way to sort of ease those tensions between people.
Okay, so Sarah Nezamani, research fellow at IVA, which is the institution headed by Dr. Akbar Zadi, asks, being a philosophy student, how did you become interested in Keynes's ideas? And if Keynes were alive, what would his comments be on climate change and US-China relationship? I guess you can just answer the climate change bit and the philosophy interest.
They're big questions, right? And it's dangerous to resurrect the dead and interrogate them. But you know, I think on climate change, that's the type of problem that Keynes would have recognized as, you know, one of the major challenges of our time. The way he thought of war as the major challenge of his own. I don't know what his big solution to climate change would be, because I'm just frankly not well versed enough in the sort of technicalities of climate change policy to understand, you know, where he might fall in the spectrum. But I think he would certainly be calling for a very large scale international cooperative effort to mobilize economies to tackle climate change. He wouldn't be asking for like small incentives in the marketplace to sort of nudge people in the right direction. He'd want governments to take direct control and do something about it.
And what about your personal philosophy background bringing you to Keynes?
I think it's why Keynes was interesting to me after the financial crisis. If Keynes had been just another economist, then, you know, I probably would have enjoyed reading him the same way I enjoy reading good economists in general. Something, you know, a set of good policy ideas, you know, a way to think about the way that the recovery, you know, took shape or didn't take shape. But because Keynes was so embedded in these different philosophical debates throughout his life, just as somebody who'd studied philosophy, it's impossible not to become just absorbed in the way that he looked at the world.
Last question, and I would have all of the gentlemen here answer this question, and I would like Zach to go last. And I'd like to start with Dr. Akbar Zadi, and here's the question. Given what we know about the stalling of economic engine in the West, massive inequality, racism, right-wing authoritarianism, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times has called this the most disturbing political phenomenon of our era, as well as the rise of China. What are some of the trends do you see globally or locally? How are political and economic institutions likely to change? Will liberal democracy survive? Or as Zach put it, is this really a dark time for democracy?
So when you cited all those things which Martin Wolf mentioned, and you said the rise of China, I don't know whether the rise of China was part of the dangerous part or the good part. So I don't know if there was a comma there in your commentary. Don't tell me. Let me just assume that yes, of course, I think you and Wolf have summarized the times that we live in. Until recently, I didn't think these were the darkest times, but now I think things have got at least personally, I think I see how these tensions are rising, and you know, if we had more Keynesianism, maybe we'd rescue the police and Portland and Trump. But I think at some point we're going to run out of Keynesianism, and it's going to be more radical politics. And I think in some ways, this is also perhaps the positive spin is that this is a turning point in many ways. Of course, there's the rise of China. Of course, China is going to survive racism because, you know, it's well integrated there. Exclusion is well integrated there. It's a very different phenomenon. And maybe in some ways, we may not be seeing the end of Keynesianism or capitalism, but we are seeing the marginalization of US and US power globally, and perhaps also in terms of a nation. And there is, of course, a corrective taking place through Black Lives Matter, through popular unrest, through the complete sort of avoidance of any discussion about climate change under Trump. And if it's 4 more years, then then I think we'll probably reach an end of history in some ways that we have imagined it. If there is a change, that'll just delay many trends. But of course, I think we are in many important ways at very major transformations globally, nationally, and democratically. Is this the end of democracy? I don't think so. I think it's a reinvention of different types of democracies, and you know, whatever that means. Again, I'll be very vague there.
Dr. Asad Said.
Well, these are, globally speaking, these are definitely the darkest times that I've lived in, and it's going to continue for some time. The good thing is that, as always, or at least in the recent past, that there is resistance, and you take some sukha from that resistance, and that this shall pass. At what cost is the question. I do not think that this trend of authoritarianism or demagoguery that is prevalent globally can sustain itself over time. So, but it may just inflict a huge cost. But in the long run, we can be hopeful. We have to be hopeful, and there's going to be resistance, and we shall prevail.
Zachary Carter, I would like you to especially address, you know, given the different trends that I've mentioned, are we going to see a new international order emerge out of this, whatever is going on right now?
Oh, I think we already are seeing a new international order emerging. I mean, even what we still call globalization has changed so much just over the past several months. The sort of knee-jerk political, and economic policies that the United States is willing to implement, even under a very conservative right-wing government, have changed quite a bit. I mean, we're manufacturing ventilators in the United States. That wasn't happening before, and I think what exactly the new order looks like is incredibly difficult to predict, right? This will take years of negotiations and probably future economic cataclysms as well to sort of take formal shape. But absolutely, I think a new order will emerge. But I also think, the United States government for the last several years has been not exactly a model of efficiency and effectiveness. You're seeing that very, very clearly in the pandemic. But American democracy, in a lot of ways, is stronger now than I think it's been in my lifetime. The protests that we've seen in the streets in just about every American city over this summer, we've just not seen that type of popular expression of political will in the United States. Now, there are places where this gets out of hand, but people are very serious about they're very serious about the idea that their government can and should be responsive to the problems of the day. They haven't always really expressed that in the United States, certainly not in my lifetime. And certainly not with this kind of force. So people don't do that unless they believe that it's possible for their government to do this. So I think the belief in democracy, even though we do have this sort of global rise in authoritarianism, which is very, very troubling, the response from people who believe in democracy of all different kinds of people. It's not just, hardcore leftists who are out there in the streets. That to me is a very encouraging development.
Okay, so you remember when I said that was my last question? I lied. That wasn't my last question. I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask all three of you the following. Which book are you reading right now, and what is the book about? So if you could just briefly tell us about a book that you're reading and what is the book about. I think we owe it to our viewers that you should share something about your the book that you're reading. Thank you. And that is really my last question. So let's have Akbar Zadi, the same order, Akbar Zadi, Asad Saeed, and Zach Carter. And the answer cannot be The Price of Peace.
Yeah, I wish I was reading The Price of Peace, because after hearing so much about the book, as I said earlier, I can't not read it. Anyway, my interest has from economics and political economy has shifted into a very strange direction, and it's on intellectual history, colonial history in the 19th century in South Asia, and specifically the notion of identity and Islam and Muslim, not so much Islam as in theology, but Islam as in a marker. And one of the books that I'm reading, that I've just finished reading and reviewing, is a book by a very, very outstanding book by Sher Ali Tareen, who's a Pakistani, of Pakistani origin. And the book is called Defending Muhammad in Modernity. And here it is. It looks at debates between the Barelvis and the Deobandis in the 19th century. And my own work is based on similar arguments. So it's an interest in intellectual history, in how Muslim identity exists. Unfortunately, it's not about economics.
Dr. Asad Saeed.
I'm actually reading two books, both not economics. One is The Grapes of Wrath, which I'm reading fully for the first time, and Pankaj Mishra's The Age of Anger.
Three good ones. I'm reading the book. I think it's been out for a few years, but is only now available in an English translation. It's called Time of the Magicians by a sort of philosopher, intellectual historian named Wolfram Eilenberger. It's a kind of a four-part biography of Wittgenstein, Walter Benjamin, Heidegger, and Cassirer, just about the development of sort of European continental philosophy in the 1920s. And for me, it's sort of an act of escapism. I haven't really read about these guys since I was in college, and so just going and learning about the lives of these kind of weird, eccentric philosophers is a lot of fun. I don't know how politically relevant it is to this particular moment, but I'm only about a third of the way to the book, so it may become frighteningly relevant.
You're muted, Dr.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I did not share the book that I'm reading. Like I mentioned it before, I'm reading The Technology Trap by Carl Benedict Frey. And it's really very interesting. It's a book on economic history. And I do like reading books by Adam Tooze, somebody that Dr. Akbar Zadi mentioned. I think like all good things, this discussion is now coming to an end. And I'm very glad that we were able to finally make it happen, given what happened in Karachi. It was a very catastrophic event here last Thursday, and I'm happy we were able to make this work. I'd like to officially invite you to Karachi, Pakistan, Zach, and you have a few universities that would be interested in listening to what you have to say. Hopefully, your travels will bring you to Karachi one day. You'll be able to see the city in much more, in a much more personal way. And I would also like to thank Dr. Asad Saeed for taking time out of his busy schedule, as well as Dr. Akbar Zadi, who I know has been traveling, but brilliant questions. And then finally, Zach, I'm very, very thankful that you took out time out of your busy schedule, and let's stay in touch. Let's this not be the final time that we have spoken. Hopefully your travels will bring you to Pakistan one day. Thank you very much.
Certainly
Thank
hope
you.
so.
And
Thank you.
let us know when you're coming so that I can read your book by then and talk to you about page by page rather than read a review and talk to you about your book.
Will do. I can't wait. And you guys, please come to the United States at some point. New York and DC are pretty gross in the summer, but the rest of the year it's pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.